There are truths that arrive like thunder, loud enough to split a family in half in a single instant. And then there are truths that arrive like poison in the bloodstream, quiet at first, almost invisible, only revealing their full violence once they have already reached the heart. For Lily, this truth came wrapped in hospital light, in the sterile chill of corridors where life and death were measured in numbers, in test results, in the trembling hands of doctors who no longer had enough good news to offer. Malcolm was dying by inches, and the terror of that reality had already stripped away every illusion Lily had left about control. She had spent so much time trying to hold together a world that was always threatening to crack beneath her feet, but nothing had prepared her for the moment when hope itself turned into a deeper form of betrayal. Holden was not just part of the answer, he was the answer, the only viable donor, the only person whose blood, marrow, and biological truth could pull Malcolm back from the edge. And the cruelty of it was unbearable, because the man who could save Malcolm was also the man bound to him by a secret so corrosive that its exposure threatened to rot the entire Winters family from the inside out. When Lily finally told Holden the truth, her body seemed to reject the words even as she forced them out. She had imagined shock, confusion, maybe even anger. She had imagined disbelief sharp enough to wound. What she had not imagined was stillness. Holden did not recoil like a man learning something impossible. He did not fracture under the weight of revelation. He froze in a way that was somehow worse, like a man watching a prediction confirm itself. In that terrible stillness, Lily felt the ground tilt beneath her. She saw it in his face before he ever admitted it. He already knew. He had known long before she stood before him shaking with desperation, long before Malcolm's condition worsened into an emergency no one could ignore, long before this family began tearing itself apart, trying to find a miracle hidden somewhere inside bloodlines and buried sins. Holden had carried the truth in silence and watched them all suffer beneath it. That knowledge struck Lily harder than any shouted confession ever could. It was not ignorance that stood before her. It was concealment, choice, calculation. In a single moment, the crisis changed shape. What had seemed like a desperate medical plea became something darker, uglier, and far more intimate. This was no longer only about persuading a frightened man to help save a life. This was about a history steeped in resentment, lies, abandonment, and injuries too old to have names simple enough for healing. Lily realized with a wave of cold horror that Malcolm's collapse was now tied to a reckoning the family had postponed for years. The past was not buried. It had been preserved in silence, in carefully omitted truths, in people deciding that secrets were kinder than exposure. But secrets were never kind. They were merely delayed weapons. Now one of those weapons sat in Holden's chest, breathing, remembering, and refusing to forget. Lily's fear for Malcolm became tangled with a rising, almost unbearable anger. She could endure disease. She could endure uncertainty. What she could not endure was the idea that Malcolm's life had become trapped inside another person's unresolved hatred. Holden's silence revealed not just knowledge, but intent. He had known he was Malcolm's half-brother. He had known he could one day matter in some irreversible way. And instead of stepping forward, he had remained hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting, perhaps even savoring the power that truth gave him. Lily's mind raced backward through every interaction, every hesitation, every strange look she had dismissed, because there had not yet been enough evidence to turn suspicion into accusation. Now every memory returned sharpened. Every pause in Holden's behavior seemed charged with a secret contempt she had failed to identify in time. At Malcolm's bedside, the weight of it became almost too much to carry. He lay there diminished by illness, but still radiating the ghost of the strength that had defined him for so long. The sight of him stripped Lily raw. This was not merely a man in danger. This was family, history, memory, the living proof of everything they had loved and everything they had failed. She could not separate him from childhood warmth, from complicated loyalties, from the impossible standard of strength the Winters family had always tried to live up to, even while quietly breaking under it. And now that life, that legacy, might end not only because fate had been cruel, but because someone had chosen not to intervene when he could have. It was too monstrous to accept cleanly. It made Lily feel as though the hospital itself had become infected, the air thick not only with fear but with treachery. The deeper she dug, the uglier it became. A discrepancy surfaced, small at first, almost bureaucratic, the kind of anomaly exhausted families might miss in the chaos of a medical crisis. But Lily was too desperate now to overlook anything. The test results did not align cleanly. Timelines felt wrong. Paperwork had shifted in ways that made no sense. What began as unease became obsession, and obsession became discovery. Someone had altered the test. Someone had interfered with the one path that might have brought Malcolm a real chance. When the truth finally revealed itself, it did not arrive with relief. It arrived like a final desecration. Holden had manipulated the results. Holden had not merely hidden the truth of his connection. He had actively tampered with the process that could save Malcolm. That was the moment Lily's grief crossed a line from pain into fury so absolute it felt purifying. Until then, some wounded part of her had still been searching for an excuse. Fear, confusion, trauma, some deep emotional paralysis she could maybe understand even if she could not forgive it. But changing the test destroyed all gentler interpretations. This was no passive refusal. It was action. Deliberate sabotage. A choice made in the full knowledge that Malcolm's life hung in the balance. Holden had not just stepped away from responsibility. He had reached into the machinery of hope and poisoned it. The realization made Lily physically ill. She felt it not only as rage, but as humiliation, because it meant the family had been navigating this crisis under false premises, while Holden stood close enough to watch the suffering he had intensified. He had turned their desperation into theater. He had allowed them to keep believing time was the enemy while he himself quietly became a greater one. Holden's motives were born from older wounds, but that did not make them nobler. If anything, it made them more tragic and more dangerous. What lived inside him was not simple cruelty for its own sake. It was the corrosion that builds when a person constructs an identity around inherited rejection. To know oneself as the hidden son, the unclaimed blood, the living evidence of a betrayal someone else wanted erased, was to grow up inside a kind of spiritual exile. Holden had not simply been deprived of acknowledgement. He had been shaped by the knowledge that other people's comfort depended on his invisibility. That kind of wound does not stay still. It mutates. It turns dignity into hunger, hunger into resentment, resentment into a need for consequence. Malcolm, whether fairly or not, had come to embody the polished version of the family life Holden had been denied. In Holden's eyes, Malcolm was not just a man in need of saving. He was the symbol of a life built atop another life's exclusion. Saving him might have felt, to Holden, like participating yet again in his own erasure. And yet motive did not lessen monstrosity. Lily understood pain. She understood what generations of silence could do to a person. She understood that families often produce their own disasters by burying inconvenient truths until they metastasized. But understanding had limits. A man hovering near death could not be reduced to an instrument of revenge. Malcolm's body could not become the courtroom in which Holden tried the past. That was where Lily's compassion ended, and something much fiercer took its place. She no longer looked at Holden as a wounded relative standing at the edge of a terrible choice. She looked at him as a man who had crossed into moral darkness and dragged them all with him. He had made Malcolm's suffering part of his punishment. He had decided that inherited pain gave him the right to play God. What made everything worse was the family history surrounding Malcolm itself. Lily knew too well that this crisis did not emerge from clean hands. Malcolm's past was not spotless, and that truth gnawed at her because it complicated every instinct to defend him unconditionally. There had been choices, betrayals, buried relationships, half-told stories, and moments where ego had clearly mattered more than honesty. The foundation of this disaster had been laid long before Holden ever manipulated a result. Somewhere in the family's past, adults had chosen silence over responsibility, image over truth, peace over justice. They had built a structure so fragile that one determined act of vengeance could now threaten to collapse the whole thing. Lily hated that. She hated that Malcolm might be paying for sins he had committed, for sins committed against him, and for sins committed around him. She hated that innocence no longer seemed available to anyone. That was the battle raging inside her, the desire to save Malcolm at any cost, and the horrifying realization that saving him might require exposing truths that would permanently stain his name. She stood at the center of two irreconcilable loyalties. One was to life itself, to the desperate human instinct that says nothing matters more than keeping someone breathing. The other was to truth, to the conviction that the family could no longer survive being protected by lies. Every hour, Malcolm weakened, and every hour, the temptation grew stronger to suppress the ugliness, to beg Holden privately, to preserve whatever fragile dignity remained. But Lily could feel something inside her hardening against that old pattern. Silence had created this. Silence had allowed Holden to become a ghost inside the family, and then a saboteur inside its most sacred emergency. Silence had taught everyone that peace was something purchased with denial. Lily was no longer willing to pay that price. As Malcolm's condition deteriorated, the hospital became a pressure chamber of fear and suspicion. Everyone sensed that something was wrong, but the full truth had not yet detonated. Nurses spoke in careful tones. Doctors moved with increasing urgency. Family members clung to half information and strained hope. Beneath it all, Lily carried the burden of what she now knew, and it transformed her. Grief sharpened into resolve. She began to see that exposing Holden would not simply be an act of revenge. It would be an act of interruption. If she said nothing, if she kept preserving the family's appearance for one more day, then Malcolm's blood would be only the first cost. The poison would remain. Holden would continue existing inside their lives as an unanswered accusation, and whatever rot had made this possible would deepen. Holden, for his part, seemed trapped in a war between vindication and ruin. He had wanted Malcolm to feel helpless, or perhaps wanted the family to feel helpless, before the truth they had denied him. But vengeance is rarely as clean in execution as it appears in fantasy. Once Lily saw through him, once the altered results became undeniable, Holden could no longer hide inside righteousness. He stood exposed not just as the forgotten son, but as the man who had weaponized that abandonment into attempted destruction. There was fury in him still, but now there was also panic. The cameras were gone, the hospital not a criminal lair, but something almost more punishing, a place where morality still had witnesses. Every second Malcolm hovered near death made Holden's choices harder to explain as anything but cruelty. The old injuries that once gave him emotional cover now seemed small beside the enormity of what he had risked. Lily's anger became volcanic, but it was not wild. That was what made it dangerous. She did not want a scene for the sake of a scene. She wanted consequence. She wanted the whole architecture of deception ripped open, no matter whose reputation collapsed under the weight of it. For too long, the Winters family had survived by controlling the story, by deciding which truths were survivable and which had to remain buried for the supposed good of everyone involved. That instinct had now nearly cost Malcolm his life. Lily could not unsee that. She could not unlearn the lesson. If Malcolm had helped create the conditions for Holden's bitterness, then that too needed to come into the light. If older generations had lied, hidden affairs, rearranged timelines, and protected themselves while children absorbed the fallout, then those choices had to be named. The crisis had become bigger than one man's illness. It had become a reckoning with the entire moral history of the family. The decision she made in that state of desperation was shocking, precisely because it violated the old code. She would expose everything, not selectively, not strategically. Everything. She would drag the hidden bloodlines, the betrayal, the manipulation of the tests, the older sins Malcolm had been insulated from or complicit in, all of it into the open. She knew what that meant. It meant public humiliation. It meant shattering whatever idealized image remained of the family. It meant that Malcolm, even if saved, might wake into a world where the truth around him had scorched every relationship he depended on. It meant that people she loved would hate her for choosing revelation over protection. But Lily had reached the point where protecting the family felt indistinguishable from killing it slowly. The rot had to be cut out, even if the surgery left nothing recognizable behind. In that decision there was both courage and cruelty, and Lily knew it. She was not acting from purity. Part of her wanted Holden destroyed for what he had done. Part of her wanted Malcolm forced to confront the human cost of the secrets that had shaped his life. Part of her wanted the family to suffer because she was exhausted from being the one expected to carry the emotional burden of everyone else's damage with grace. Years of restraint, diplomacy, forgiveness, and careful stewardship had brought her here anyway, to a hospital corridor where love itself had become indistinguishable from rage. She no longer believed calm would save them. Sometimes families do not heal because no one is willing to be cruel enough to tell the whole truth. Lily was willing now. What made the moment almost unbearable was that hope still flickered. Malcolm was not gone yet. There was still time, perhaps not much, but time enough that Holden could reverse course, step forward, and do the one thing that might keep this disaster from becoming a death sentence. That possibility was its own torture. It meant Lily had to stand in the space between exposure and appeal, between condemning Holden and still needing something from him. The contradiction burned through her. She despised him, and still Malcolm's life might depend on his cooperation. She wanted to expose the family's sins, and still feared what that truth would do to Malcolm if he survived. She wanted justice, but justice did not come cleanly when blood tied victim and perpetrator together. This was the real agony of it. Not that anyone lacked motive, but that everyone's motives had become tangled with love, vengeance, shame, and the unbearable instinct to rewrite the past through present pain. By the time Lily finally accepted what she had become willing to do, she felt almost unrecognizable to herself. The woman who once believed she could guide a family through crisis with intelligence and compassion was still there, but scorched, hardened, and done asking permission to disturb the peace. In her place stood someone prepared to blow open every lie, if that was what it took to give Malcolm a chance, or at the very least to ensure that if he died, he would not die inside a web of falsehoods politely maintained for the comfort of others. Holden had forced that transformation. Malcolm's collapse had accelerated it. The family's history had made it inevitable. And so the greatest threat inside those hospital walls was no longer just illness. It was revelation. The truth had grown too large to contain, too poisoned to soften. Holden was the secret son, the hidden match, the architect of falsified hope. Malcolm was the dying center of a history that no one could keep romanticizing without becoming complicit. Lily was the one standing between life and exposure, between silence and detonation, and the fury in her no longer asked what would preserve the family. It asked what the family deserved after years of building itself on half-truths and buried damage. If saving Malcolm required ripping open every carefully sealed wound, she would do it. If loving him now meant destroying the illusion that had protected them all, she would do that too. Because the darkest truth waiting in that hospital was no longer about blood or inheritance or even survival. It was that a family can endure shame, scandal, and even hatred, but once its secrets begin demanding human sacrifice, someone must be willing to burn the whole lie down.